Welcome to Serafina Romance Audiobook, the sanctuary where the shadows speak and the heart finds its wildest rhythm. Are you ready to lose yourself in a world where ancient bloodlines collide with frozen hearts? Tonight, we descend into the Frost-Spire Palace, a kingdom ruled by a king who turned his soul to ice to keep the peace. But even the deepest permafrost can't stop the heat of a forbidden bond. In this world of shifting shadows and primal instincts, the ultimate question remains, can a man who only knows how to crush ever learn how to hold? Tonight's tale is a journey of high-stakes treason, sizzling paranormal romance, and the raw power of the mate bond. Dim the lights, find your sanctuary, and let the thaw begin. Chapter 1. The Executioner's Mercy. Blood on the snow is the only color in my world. I watched the red stains spread like a hungry flower across the white courtyard. This was my throne. A seat of ice, built on the bones of a family I wiped out 20 years ago. The man on his knees before me was shaking. He was a Valerius sympathizer, a ghost worshipper. He believed the old bloodline still had a right to rule. He was wrong. "Any last words?" I asked. My voice was as cold as the mountain air. Truth be told, I didn't care about his words. I only cared about the order of my kingdom. "The sun will rise on a Valerius again, King Soren," the man screamed. Next, I raised my hand. I felt the magic hum in my veins. It was a heavy, dead weight. I am the Nullifier. My power doesn't create life, it swallows it. I reached out with my mind and wrapped my power around his heart. It was like putting out a candle with a wet thumb. His magical aura, a weak flickering blue, just vanished. To make things worse, the High Inquisitor Malachor was watching from the balcony. He was like a vulture in white robes. He loved the smell of death because it meant he was still in control. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with a sick kind of joy. "Cleanly done, Your Majesty," Malachor called out. His voice was smooth, but it felt like sandpaper on my soul. What followed was the dull thud of the axe. I didn't flinch. If I felt nothing, I couldn't be hurt. I turned my back on the body. Still, something felt off. The air should have been freezing. Instead, a strange, localized warmth brushed against my cheek. It was a phantom heat, a ghost of a sensation I hadn't felt since I was a boy. Maybe it was fate playing tricks on me. I looked around, searching for the source. There was nothing but stone and soldiers. Yet the warmth lingered. It felt like a heartbeat against my skin. Moments later, the warmth faded. I walked toward the palace doors, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. Deep down, she knew the truth. No, I knew the truth. My kingdom was a tomb, and I was the one who locked the door. Why did the air feel like a summer breeze in the middle of a winter execution? I didn't have the answer. I only had the cold. Chapter 2. The Ghost in the Stone. The ramparts were my only sanctuary. I walked the high walls of the Frost-Spire Palace alone. The wind howled like a wounded wolf, but I didn't feel the bite. My armor was thick, but my skin was thicker. I looked down at the city below. It looked like a graveyard of tiny lights. "You spend too much time in the clouds, Soren," I whispered to myself. Instead of going inside, I leaned against the stone. I looked down toward the servant entrances. They were like ants scurrying in and out of the cellar. They were the invisible ones. They cooked the food, cleaned the blood, and stayed out of the light. But then, I saw her. She was a small shadow, wrapped in a gray cloak that had seen better days. She was carrying a lead-lined box toward the cellar stairs. She moved differently than the others. Most servants walked with their heads down, heavy with the weight of their lives. She moved like she was made of mist. Without thinking, I leaned further over the edge. Who was she? Why was she carrying something that looked so heavy? As if summoned, she paused. She didn't look up at me. She couldn't see me in the shadows of the battlements. She clutched the box to her chest as if it were a precious child. In that moment, the wind shifted. The scent hit me. It wasn't the smell of soot or grease. It was the scent of winter jasmine and old, powerful earth. It was a smell that belonged in a palace, not a cellar. Soon after, she disappeared into the darkness of the stone. She was a ghost in my own house. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of melancholy. I was a king with 1,000 soldiers, but I didn't have a single person who knew my name. On the other hand, Malachor was probably already drafting more execution orders. My life was a cycle of iron and blood. I turned away from the edge. My world tilted for a second. That warmth from the courtyard was back. It was stronger now. It was coming from the cellar where she had gone. She didn't know what scared her more, but I knew what scared me. I was starting to feel curious. And in this palace, curiosity was a death sentence. Chapter 3: The Hum in the Blood. The Council of Iron sat in a circle. They looked like statues of old men, frozen in their own greed. Malachor sat at my right hand. He was tapping a long finger on the wooden table. The sound was like a clock ticking down to my own demise. "We have a problem," Malachor said. In fact, he loved having problems because it gave him an excuse to use his purifiers. He looked at the other council members with a grim smile. "A relic is missing from the lower vaults," he continued. "The seal of the traitor house, it vanished last night." Because of that, the room grew cold. The Valerius name was a curse. We had burned their banners. We had killed their children. The idea that anything of theirs remained was an insult to our rule. "It's a hunk of blackened iron, Malachor," I said, my voice dry. "It has no power without the blood to wake it." "Still, it is a symbol," Malachor hissed. "Symbols give people hope, and hope is a rot that spreads." What followed was a long argument about security. They wanted to search the servants. They wanted to raid the city. I sat back, watching them. I felt a low vibration in my chest. It wasn't my heart. It was my blood. My blood was humming. It was a low, steady throb. It was the same rhythm as the warmth I had felt. It felt like a call. Or a warning. I gripped the arms of my throne until my knuckles turned white. No matter how hard she tried, the girl from the cellar couldn't be a coincidence. "Find the relic," I ordered, "but do it quietly. I won't have the city in a panic over a piece of scrap metal." As the silence stretched, I felt the humming grow louder. It was a physical pull. It was as if something inside me was trying to break through my skin. By the time the meeting ended, I was sweating in the freezing room. I walked out without a word to Malachor. I needed to find that girl. I needed to know why my body was reacting to a ghost in the cellar. As if fate demanded it, the palace seemed to grow darker as I walked. The shadows danced between them, between my past and my future. I reached my private chambers and slammed the door. Truth be told, I was terrified. My power was the Nullifier. I was the man who brought silence. But now, for the first time in 20 years, the silence was screaming. Chapter 4: The Solstice Ball. The Great Hall was a sea of gold and fake smiles. It was the Solstice Ball, the one night of the year when we pretended the winter wasn't trying to kill us. I was dancing with a duchess whose name I had already forgotten. She was talking about silk, but I was listening to the heartbeat of the castle. The air thickened. The vibration in my blood was now a roar. It was so intense I could barely breathe. I stepped through the dance steps mechanically. My eyes scanned the room, and then everything changed. A servant girl, the shadow from the ramparts, stumbled near the refreshment table. She was dressed in the rough linen of a kitchen maid. She looked out of place among the jewels, but she wasn't the reason the music died. Without warning, a brilliant light erupted from her chest. It wasn't magic as I knew it. It was a raw, ancient fire. It burned through her tunic, revealing a blackened iron ring on a chain around her neck. The light wasn't just glowing, it was pulsing in time with my own heart. The moment their eyes locked, I felt it. Clear as day. The space between them burned. My nullification flared up, trying to swallow the light, but for the first time in my life, it failed. The fire didn't go out. Instead, It reached for me. "Valerius!" someone screamed. The tension broke. My first instinct was to kill her. My hand went to my sword. She was the enemy. She was the heir to the house I had butchered. She was a threat to everything I had built. But then, the mate bond slammed into me. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. It was a chain of gold and fire wrapping around my soul and snapping tight. She wasn't just a thief. She wasn't just a traitor. She was mine. As the silence roared, I stood frozen. The Duchess fled from my side. The guards drew their spears. Elara, I didn't even know her name yet, but my bones remembered him. Her, stood in the center of the floor, trembling. Mine, my wolf whispered in the back of my mind. I didn't even know I had a wolf left. I thought I had nullified him years ago. Her breath caught. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. She saw the monster. She saw the man who had killed her family. "Stop!" I roared. My voice echoed through the hall like thunder. I walked toward her. Every step felt like walking through deep water. The light from the ring was so bright it was blinding. It was reacting to my presence. It was proving her identity to the world. She felt it, clear as day. We were two halves of a broken world, finally colliding. And I didn't know if I was going to save her or crush her. Between us, something cracked. The foundation of my kingdom, the wall around my heart. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I already knew. Before the words left her lips, she collapsed. I caught her before she hit the floor. The contact was like an explosion of heat. Fire bloomed beneath her skin. I looked up at Malachor. He was standing on the dais, his face twisted in horror and rage. He saw the bond. He saw his control slipping away. That night, the ice began to melt, and I realized that the woman in my arms was the only thing in the world that could truly burn me. Chapter 5: The Lion and the Lamb. Her body was a feather in my arms, but her weight felt like a mountain. I carried her through the silent, shocked ballroom. Every eye was a needle. Every whisper was a blade. My guards stepped aside, their armor clinking like funeral bells because they could see the raw, unchecked power rolling off me. I didn't look at Malachor. I didn't look at the council. I only looked at the door. Next, I kicked open the heavy oak doors of my private solar. I slammed them shut behind us. I didn't bother with the lock. My power was enough of a barrier. I laid her on the velvet sofa, her soot-stained skin a stark contrast against the royal purple. Truth be told, I wanted to run. My skin was crawling. The warmth I'd felt earlier was now a raging forest fire, centered right where our bodies had touched. I looked at the blackened iron ring. It sat on her chest like a living coal, cooling slowly now that I had put some distance between us. "Wake up," I growled. I used my nullification, pushing a wave of cold air toward her to snap her out of the faint. She didn't wake. Rather, she sighed. It was a soft, broken sound that made my chest ache. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the ring. As the silence stretched, I realized what I was doing. I was a king. She was a Valerius. My duty was to call the headsman. Yet my hand moved without my permission. I touched the metal. Between one breath and the next, the world exploded. I wasn't in the solar anymore. I was in a memory of fire and screaming. I saw my own younger self, sword red with the blood of her kin. Then I felt her. Her loneliness, her years of scrubbing floors in the dark, her hunger. Her heart skipped, and her eyes flew open. "Don't kill me," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp, but it cut through my defenses like a hot wire through snow. "I should," I said, but I didn't move. I couldn't. "You're a thief. You're a ghost. You're a Valerius." "I'm nothing," she choked out. She tried to scramble backward, her movements frantic and clumsy. "I found it on the wall. I didn't know it would do that." Before she could move any further, I leaned down, pinning her shoulders to the velvet. The air thickened. Her scent, jasmine and earth, was everywhere. It was intoxicating. It was a drug I didn't know I was addicted to until this very second. It reacted to me, I hissed, my face inches from hers. The bond doesn't lie, little ghost. It says you belong to me, and I belong to you. She didn't know what scared her more, the king who wanted her dead or the mate who wanted her alive. Chapter 6. The Secret in the Tower. The interrogation was a failure because I couldn't focus. Every time she spoke, my wolf paced in the back of my mind, demanding I mark her. I paced the room instead. The solar was a cage, and we were two predators circling one another. I need a name, I demanded. A real one. Elara, she whispered. She was huddled on the sofa, her knees pulled to her chest. She looked so small, so fragile. Elara, I repeated. When her name left his lips, my lips, the bond pulsed. It was a physical jolt. It felt like my very bones were recognizing her. Soon after, I heard the heavy thrum of boots in the hallway. Malachor. I knew that walk. It was the walk of a man who was coming to take what was mine. My blood turned to ice, not from my power, but from fear for her. Deep down, I knew the truth. If I gave her to him, he would find a way to make her execution last for days. He would study the bond as he broke it. He would tear her apart to see how she worked. Hide, I commanded. Where? She asked, her voice trembling. Instead of answering, I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the servants' passage behind the tapestry. It was a narrow, dark space. I pushed her inside just as the doors to the solar burst open. Soren! Malachor bellowed. He was purple with rage, his white robes fluttering like the wings of a moth. Where is the girl? The council demands her for the purification ritual. Still, I stood my ground. I leaned against my desk, crossing my arms over my chest. I felt my nullification flare, creating a literal wall of cold between me and the Inquisitor. She is mine to question, I said. My voice was a low, dangerous rumble. I am the king, Malachor. Or have you forgotten whose head the crown sits upon? She is Valerius, he screamed. She is the rot. If you keep her, you are a traitor to your own throne. Then I am a traitor, I said. The words felt right. They felt like the first honest thing I had said in 20 years. To make things worse, I could hear Elara's breathing behind the wall. It was fast and shallow. I had to get her out of here. I had to get her to the high tower. I will find her, Soren, Malachor hissed, his eyes narrowing into slits. And when I do, I will burn the Valerius out of you both. He turned and marched out, the doors slamming behind him. I didn't move until the sound of his footsteps faded. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. And just like that, everything changed. I was no longer protecting a kingdom. I was protecting a girl. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. The high tower was the tallest point in the Frost-Spire. It was a place of wind and light, far away from the damp cellars she had called home. I led her up the winding stairs in the dead of night. We were shadows moving through a palace of ghosts. Why are you doing this? She asked. Maybe it was fate, or maybe I was just tired of being alone. I didn't have an answer that made sense. Because the bond won't let me do anything else, I said. I opened the door to the master suite. It was filled with silk, fur, and gold. It was a cage, but it was a beautiful one. Moments later, she walked into the center of the room. She looked out the window at the moonlit mountains. The light caught the tears on her cheeks. I was safe in the dark, she whispered. I was a ghost. No one saw me. I see you now, I said. The space between them burned. I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the thick rugs. I stopped just a hair's breadth away. I could feel the heat radiating off her. As if pulled by a string, she turned to face me. Her eyes were wide, searching my face for the monster. But she didn't find him. Not tonight. You're the king who killed them, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. My mother, my father, my brothers. I was told they were a plague, I said. My voice was thick with a regret I couldn't name. I was told your blood would rot the world. Do I feel like a plague to you? She asked. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the center of my chest, right over my heart. As her wolf stirred, no, as my heart hammered, I felt the nullification break. I felt everything. I felt the cold wind outside, the warmth of her hand, the crushing weight of 20 years of lies. No, I whispered. You feel like the sun? Before either could speak, I took her hand. I didn't crush it. I held it. It was a small, fragile thing, but it held the power to destroy me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the strength she had used to survive the cellars. Malachor will come for you, I said. He will use the council. He will use the law. But he will have to go through me first. Why save the enemy? She asked. Because, I said, leaning down until our foreheads touched. Because I'm tired of being the only person in this palace who isn't breathing. At that moment, a pact was made, not of laws or kingdoms, but of blood and fire. I was the nullifier, and she was the spark. And together, we were going to set the world on fire. Chapter 8. The Conspirator's Choice. The sun began to rise, turning the snow-capped peaks into gold. I stood by the door of the high tower, watching her sleep. She looked peaceful, but I knew the peace wouldn't last. The hunt had already begun. By the time I reached the main hall, Malachor was already there with the silent guard. They were the elite, the mage hunters. They didn't speak. They only obeyed. The council has voted, Malachor said. He held a scroll with the iron seal. The girl is to be handed over for a public trial at midday. The girl is my personal informant, I said, my voice projecting across the hall. She has information regarding a valerious plot against the crown. I will interrogate her myself. And if we find you are lying, Malachor asked. He stepped closer, his scent like rot and old incense. If we find you are harboring a traitor, then you can try to take the crown from my head, I said. What followed was a tense standoff. The silent guard shifted, their hands on their weapons. My own loyalist guards mirrored the movement. The air was thick with the scent of impending war. You are playing a dangerous game, Soren, Malachor warned. The bond is a trick of the traitor house. It is a glamour. It is the rot taking hold of your mind. Maybe, I said, but it's my mind, and it's my girl. I turned my back on him. It was a deliberate insult. I walked back toward the stairs, my heart racing. I had made my choice. I was no longer a king who followed orders. I was a man who followed a feeling. As the sky darkened with an incoming storm, I realized the magnitude of what I had done. I had just declared war on my own kingdom. I had tied my fate to a girl I barely knew. But as I climbed the stairs back to her, I didn't feel the cold. I felt the heat of the ring pulsing in my pocket. I felt the bond pulling me forward. Truth be told, I had never felt more alive. In the quiet that followed, I reached the door. I paused, my hand on the handle. I knew that once I walked through, there was no turning back, and she let it happen. I pushed the door open, ready to face the storm. Chapter 9. The Mirror and the Mask. I stood by the window of the high tower, watching the snow bury the world below. It was a beautiful view, but it felt like a grave. Behind me, I could hear the rustle of silk. Elara was trying on the gowns I had ordered, dresses made of heavy velvet and silver thread meant to hide the servant beneath the finery. I feel like I'm wearing a costume, she whispered. Instead of looking at her, I kept my eyes on the horizon. I was afraid that if I turned around, the bond would snap me like a dry twig. In this palace, everyone is wearing a costume, Elara. The only difference is how well you play the part. Next, I heard her footsteps. They were light, but in the silence of the tower, they sounded like thunder. I felt her stop just inches behind me. The heat from her body rolled over my back like a summer wave. My nullification flared, trying to freeze the sensation, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of sand. "You're shaking, Soren," she said. As the silence stretched, I realized she was right. My hands were gripped so tight on the windowsill that the stone was starting to crack. Truth be told, I was terrified of her, not because of her bloodline, but because of the way she looked at me, as if I were a man and not a monument of ice. "I am fine," I lied. But then, she moved. She didn't touch me, but she stepped into my line of sight. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue. The silver sigils on the sleeves caught the light, mirroring the reactive glow of the ring hidden beneath her collar. She didn't look like a kitchen maid anymore. She looked like the queen I had been hunting for 20 years. "You aren't fine," she murmured. Her voice was a soft caress against my frayed nerves. "You're empty. You've spent so long silencing everything around you that you've forgotten how to hear your own heart." Before I could speak, she reached out. She didn't go for my hand. Rather, she pressed her palm against the center of my chest. At that moment, everything I had built began to crumble. My power, the cold void I used to stay sane, simply evaporated. I could feel the thrum of the palace, the wind against the glass, and the frantic, desperate beat of my own heart answering hers. "Don't!" I choked out. Despite that, she didn't pull away. She stepped closer until our breath mingled in the cold air. She was using her hyper-awareness, reading the micro-twitches of my muscles and the dilation of my eyes. "Why are you so afraid of feeling something?" she asked. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the 20 years of loneliness finally breaking me. I grabbed her wrist, my grip firm but not crushing. I wanted to push her away, but my body moved on instinct, pulling her closer instead. "Because if I feel," I hissed, "I have to remember what I did to get this crown. I have to remember that I am the villain in your story." Her heart skipped, but she didn't flinch. She looked up at me with those wide, knowing eyes. "Then stop being the villain, Soren. Start being the king." Chapter 10. The Etiquette of War. The transformation had to be perfect because Malachor was watching like a hawk. I spent the next 3 days in that tower, teaching Elara the lethal dance of the court. We practiced the walk, the tilt of the head, and the way to hold a wine glass as if it were a weapon. "Lower your chin," I commanded. I was pacing the room, my voice sharp. "You are a Valerius. You don't look up at them for permission. You look down at them with pity." Soon after, she tried again. She glided across the room, the silk of her dress hissing against the stone. She looked perfect. She looked deadly. But her eyes were still full of the girl who hid in the cellars. "I can't do the voice," she said, stopping mid-step. "I sound like me." "Then don't speak," I said, walking toward her. "Silence is power, Elara. If you don't speak, they will fill the silence with their own fears. That is how I have ruled for 2 decades. What followed was a lesson in deception. I showed her how to mask her scent, how to slow her pulse, and how to ignore the reactive hum of the ring when I got close. It was a torture for both of us. Every time I touched her shoulder to correct her posture, a bolt of electricity shot through my arm. "Is this how you live?" she asked during a break. "Always calculating? Always hiding?" "It is how I survive," I replied. Not only that, but I realized I was enjoying it. I was enjoying the way her mind worked. She was faster than any of my generals. She saw the holes in my logic before I even finished my sentences. She wasn't just a mate, she was a partner. "Malachor suspects," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I see him in the gardens, looking up at this window. He knows I'm here." "Let him look," I said, though my gut twisted with anxiety. "He cannot enter without my permission." Still, the council is growing restless. They want a public showing. They want to see the informant who has captured the king's attention. "And if I fail?" "You won't fail," I said. stepping into her space. I tucked a stray hair behind her ear. My fingers brushed her skin, and for a second, the world narrowed until it was only us. Because if you fail, the silence wins, and I think I'm finally done with being quiet. Before either could speak, the bells of the great cathedral began to chime. It was a summons. The council was demanding an audience, and she let it happen. She took my arm, her grip steady. She had found her mask. Now I just had to make sure mine didn't slip. Chapter 11. The Shadow in the Hall. The walk to the council chamber felt like a march to the scaffold. I could feel the eyes of the silent guard on us. They were like statues, their faces hidden behind iron masks, but their aura was cold and sharp. Elara walked beside me, her head held high, her face a mask of bored indifference. "Remember," I whispered, "don't react to Malachor, no matter what he says." By the time we reached the heavy iron doors, my blood was thrumming so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. The bond was pulsing, a steady violet beat that felt like a drum in my ears. "Wait!" a voice called out. It was a spy, a low-level clerk I had seen hovering around Malachor's office. He stepped out from behind a pillar, his eyes darting between us. He was holding a small glass vial filled with a dark, oily liquid. "The High Inquisitor sends his regards," the clerk said. Without thinking, the clerk lunged. He didn't go for me. He went for Elara. He tried to splash the liquid onto her face, a magic reactant that would peel away any glamour and expose her true nature. Her body moved on instinct. She didn't scream. Rather, she spun, her silver-lined skirts whipping out like a blade. She caught the clerk's wrist and twisted. The vial shattered on the stone floor, the liquid hissing and eating into the rock. At that moment, I lost control. My nullification didn't just dampen the air, it crushed it. I stepped forward and grabbed the clerk by the throat, lifting him off the ground. The hallway turned into a vacuum of absolute cold. The walls began to frost over, the moisture in the air turning into jagged ice crystals. "Who sent you?" I roared. The clerk couldn't answer. His face was turning blue as I drained the heat from his body. I felt a predatory hunger I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to end him. I wanted to show the world what happened when they touched what was mine. "Soren, stop!" Elara cried out. She grabbed my arm. Her touch was like a brand of fire on my ice-cold skin. The contact snapped me back to reality. I dropped the clerk, who slumped to the floor, gasping for air. "He's just a messenger," she whispered, her eyes full of fear, not of the clerk, but of me. As the silence roared, I looked at my hands. They were trembling. I had almost killed a man in front of a dozen witnesses because I had lost my temper. The Glacier King was cracking. "Get him out of my sight," I ordered the guards. Moments later, we were alone in the hallway. Elara was looking at the melted stone where the vial had broken. She looked pale, her mask shattered. "He almost got me," she said. "But he didn't," I said, stepping closer. I wanted to hold her, but I didn't trust myself. I was a man who only knew how to crush. "Malachor is getting desperate. That's good. It means he's afraid." "But I'm afraid too," she whispered. Truth be told, so was I. But as the doors to the council chamber opened, I straightened my back. I took her hand, and for the first time, I didn't care who saw. Chapter 12. The Iron Jury. The council chamber was a pit of shadows. The 12 members of the Council of Iron sat on high benches, their faces lit by flickering torchlight. Malachor sat in the center, his white robes looking like a shroud. "King Soren," Malachor said, his voice dripping with false concern. "We were beginning to think you had forgotten your duties." "My duties are my own, Malachor," I replied. I led Elara to the center of the floor. "I present to you my information. She has provided the crown with valuable intelligence regarding the Valerius remnants." On the other hand, the council didn't look convinced. They leaned forward, their eyes narrowed. They were looking for a flaw. They were looking for the rot. "She looks like a common girl," one councilman sneered. Why does a kitchen maid deserve the king's private quarters? Because she has a gift, I said. I felt Elara's pulse racing through our joined hands. She can sense the presence of Valerius's relics. She is the reason we found the lead-lined box. What followed was a barrage of questions. They tried to trip her up. They asked about dates, names, and locations. But Elara was perfect. She used her hyper-awareness to anticipate their questions, answering with a cold, detached precision that even Malachor couldn't find fault with. Still, the air in the room was growing heavy. The bond was reacting to the hostility in the room. The iron ring beneath Elara's dress was beginning to heat up. I could feel the vibration in my own teeth. "A compelling story," Malachor said, standing up. He walked down the steps toward us. "But words are cheap. The law requires a blood scan for any who enter the high tower." "The king's word is the law," I reminded him. "Not when it comes to the traitor house," Malachor countered. He stopped just a foot away from Elara. He leaned in, sniffing the air. "There is a scent in this room, something ancient, something forbidden." Between them, something cracked. The ring began to glow. A faint violet light started to leak through the fabric of Elara's dress. "What is that?" Malachor whispered, his eyes widening. "It is the king's favor," I said, stepping between them. I used my body to shield the light. "The meeting is adjourned. My informant needs rest." "This isn't over, Soren," Malachor called out as we turned to leave. "The solstice is in 2 days. The mountain demands a sacrifice. If it isn't the girl, it might be the king." As we walked out, I felt the mark tingled on my chest. The bond was screaming now. We were out of time. Truth be told, I knew what I had to do. I had to stop hiding her. I had to claim her, no matter the cost. As the sky darkened, I looked at Elara. She was white as a sheet, but her eyes were burning with a new fire, and she let it happen. We walked into the dark, together. Chapter 13, The Inquisitor's Gambit. The air in my private study was thick enough to choke a man. I stood at my desk, staring at a map of the kingdom, but all I saw was the violet light burned into my retinas. Malachor hadn't just suspected. He was hunting with a scent now. I could hear the purifiers marching in the courtyard below, their iron-shod boots rhythmic and merciless. Stomp, stomp, stomp. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" Elara's voice came from the shadows by the hearth. Rather than lying to her, I stayed silent. The truth was a jagged pill I couldn't swallow. I looked at her, really looked at her, and my chest ached. She was wearing a gown of silver fox fur, her pale skin glowing in the firelight. She looked like a queen, but she felt like a girl waiting for the axe to fall. Next, a sharp rap at the door shattered the silence. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. My captain of the guard entered, his face as pale as the snow outside. He held a scroll sealed with the High Inquisitor's personal wax, a black sun. "The council has issued a writ of purification, Majesty," the captain whispered. "They claim the informant is a carrier of the black rot. They demand her arrest by sunset." What followed was a cold fury that I had never felt before. It wasn't the numb, surgical cold of my nullification. This was a wild, screaming ice storm. My power flared, frost crawling across my desk and shattering my inkwell. "They will not touch her," I growled. Even so, the captain didn't move. He was a loyal man, but he was a man of the law. "The people are gathering at the palace gates, Soren. Malachor has told them the Valerius plague is back. They are screaming for her blood." Despite that, I walked over to Elara. I took her face in my hands. Her skin was freezing, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She didn't know what scared her more, the mob outside or the look in my eyes. "I have one move left," I whispered, "but it changes everything. There is no going back to the cellars after this. There is no going back to being a ghost. Anything," she breathed. "Soren, I don't want to die in the dark." Before she could move, I kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of a desperate man clinging to a lifeline. It was a promise. It was a declaration of war. And just like that, everything changed. I knew what I had to do. I had to burn my own throne to save her life. Chapter 14. The Public Betrothal. The Great Hall was a cage of gold and hatred. Thousands of nobles and citizens packed the galleries, their voices a low, ugly drone that sounded like a hive of angry hornets. Malachor stood on the high dais, his white robes gleaming under the chandelier. He held a ceremonial torch, the flame of purity, ready to signal the hunt. "Bring forth the traitor," Malachor bellowed. Soon after, the heavy doors at the back of the hall swung open. I walked in, but I wasn't alone. I had Elara's hand gripped in mine. We walked down the center aisle, the crowd falling silent as we passed. The violet light of the ring was no longer hidden. It pulsed through her dress, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat that filled the room. As the silence roared, I reached the foot of the dais. I felt the thousands of eyes digging into my back. I looked up at Malachor, who was smiling, a thin, predatory stretch of the lips. "You bring her to her own execution, Soren?" Malachor asked. "How efficient." "I bring her to her rightful place," I replied. My voice was calm, but it carried to every corner of the room. In fact, the entire council leaned forward as one. I felt Elara's fingers tremble in mine, but I didn't let go. I stepped up onto the first tier of the dais, pulling her with me. "The council claims this woman is a carrier of the rot," I announced. "They claim she is a threat to the purity of the throne, but they are wrong." Moments later, I raised our joined hands high for everyone to see. The ring on her neck erupted in a blinding violet flare. My own blood answered. My skin began to glow with a faint, silvery light, the mark of the Nullifier answering the spark of the Valerius. "She is not a traitor," I shouted. "She is my predestined mate. By the law of two souls, she is the queen of the Frost-Spire." Between them, something cracked. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was absolute. Malachor's torch slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. The mate bond was a legend, a myth from the time of the first kings. To claim it was to claim a divine right that bypassed every law the council had ever written. "You lie!" Malachor screamed, his voice cracking. "It is a glamour, a trick of the traitor house." "Then test it," I challenged. I turned to Elara. "Show them." Without thinking, Elara reached out. She didn't use fire. She used her hyper-awareness. She projected the feeling of the bond, the heat, the connection, the ancient power, outward into the room. It was like a wave of warm summer air hitting a wall of ice. Her soul answered my call. The crowd gasped as the frost on the windows began to melt in beautiful, intricate patterns. The mountain itself seemed to groan in recognition. Truth be told, Malachor looked like he wanted to strike me dead, but he couldn't. To attack a mate pair during the solstice was the highest form of sacrilege. He was trapped by the very laws he had used to cage me. As if fate demanded it, I leaned in and kissed her again, this time, for everyone to see. The space between them burned. I wasn't just a king anymore. I was a man who had found his missing half. Chapter 15. The Conduit of the Mountain. We were back in the high tower, but the world was different now. The bells were ringing across the city, not for an execution, but for a wedding. Yet, the air between us was fraught with a new kind of tension. "You claimed me," Elara said. She was standing by the window, her silhouette sharp against the rising moon. "In front of everyone. You tied your life to mine." "It was the only way to save you," I said. I was exhausted, the adrenaline fading to leave a hollow ache in my bones. On the other hand, Elara didn't look relieved. She looked powerful. The bond hadn't just saved her, it had unlocked something inside her. She held out her hand, and tiny sparks of violet light danced between her fingers. "I can feel it, Soren," she whispered. "The palace, the mountain. It's like I have 1,000 ears. I can hear the water in the pipes, the heat in the stones, the breathing of every soldier in the hall. Because of that, I realized the magnitude of what had happened. The Valerius bloodline wasn't just royalty. They were the heart of the mountain's magic. By bonding with me, she had become a conduit for the palace's ancient defenses. The reactive bond, I murmured. It didn't just find me. It chose me because I'm the only one who can dampen the power enough to keep you from burning up. And what happens if you aren't there? She asked. What followed was a moment of terrifying realization. We were no longer two people. We were a weapon. A weapon that Malachor would do anything to control or destroy. I will always be there, I promised. I walked over to her, my boots silent on the stone. I wrapped my arms around her from behind, my chest to her back. But the council won't sit idly by. They will find a way to test the bond. They will try to prove we are tainted. Let them try, she said. Her voice was different now, deeper, more resonant. As her wolf stirred, the spirit of the mountain itself, she turned in my arms. Before the words left her lips, I saw the shift in her eyes. They weren't just brown anymore. They were flecked with violet fire. The transformation was beginning, not into a monster, but into a sovereign. We have 3 days until the solstice wedding, I warned. 3 days to find the truth about the black rot before Malachor uses it to depose me. Then we don't sleep, she said. Moments later, she pulled me down into a kiss that tasted like ash and lightning. It was raw, it was passionate. It was the sizzling romance the bards sang about, but with the edge of a blade at our throats. As the silence roared, I realized I didn't care about the crown anymore. I didn't care about the purity of the throne. I only cared about the woman in my arms. And just like that, the Glacier King was gone. In his place was a man willing to burn the world to keep his mate warm. Chapter 16. The Shadow of the Rot. The night was far from over. While Elara rested, I descended to the secret archives beneath the throne room, a place even Malachor wasn't allowed to enter. I needed to know the truth. I needed to know why I had been told the Valerius were a plague. By the time I found the forbidden scrolls, my lamp was flickering. I unrolled the parchment, my eyes scanning the ancient text. My heart skipped a beat. Because, I whispered to the empty room, because it was never a rot. It was a gift. The scrolls revealed the truth. The black rot was a fabrication. It was a name given to the Valerius shadow, a rare magical ability to see the corruption in others. The previous king hadn't been sick. He had been exposing Malachor's ancestors. To make things worse, I found a letter hidden in the binding. It was from my own father. To my son, Soren, if you are reading this, the lie has succeeded. We killed them not to save the world, but to hide our own sins. The silence you bring is not peace. It is a shroud. Deep down, I knew the truth now. My entire reign was a blood-stained mistake. I had spent 20 years serving the very men who had tricked me into regicide. Before I could move, a shadow fell across the page. You shouldn't have come here, Soren. Malachor's voice hissed from the doorway. I looked up. He wasn't alone. The silent guards stood behind him, their iron masks gleaming in the lamplight. The bond has made you weak, Malachor said. It has made you curious. And curiosity, well, you know the rest. Without thinking, I tried to flare my nullification, but nothing happened. I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my neck. I reached up and pulled out a small silver needle. Magic dampener, Malachor explained, his voice a smooth purr. Developed by the council for just such an occasion. You're not a king anymore, Soren. You're just a man in a dark room. The tension broke as the guards lunged. I fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, but without my power, I was outnumbered. I felt a heavy blow to the back of my head, and she let it happen. No, she didn't know. Elara was safe in the tower, but I was falling into the dark. As the echo faded, I heard Malicor's final words. "Tell the people the king has been corrupted by the traitor's glamour. Tell them the purification begins at dawn." My thoughts spun as the darkness took me. My last thought was of her. Run, Elara. Chapter 17. The Weight of the Crown. The darkness was not my friend anymore. I woke up on the cold stone floor of the archives, my head throbbing like a war drum. My magic, that beautiful, terrible silence, was gone. It felt like someone had ripped out my lungs and expected me to breathe. I touched the back of my neck, feeling the puncture mark where the needle had bitten deep. Next, I heard the sound of a key turning in the heavy iron door. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest. The door groaned open, but it wasn't Malicor. Rather, it was Elara. She was dressed in the rough rags of a kitchen maid again, her face smeared with soot to hide her features. "Soren," she whispered, her voice a jagged line of relief. Before I could speak, she was across the room, her arms wrapping around my waist. The heat of her body was a shock to my chilled skin. Truth be told, I had never been so happy to see anyone in my life. The bond pulsed between us, a frantic, violet rhythm that told me she had felt my pain through the stone. "How did you get down here?" I asked, my voice a dry rasp. "The Shadow Army," she said, her eyes flashing with a new, hard light. "The servants. They know every crack in this palace, Soren. They led me through the sunless passages while the silent guard were busy preparing for your abdication. Still, I felt the walls closing in. I looked at the letter from my father still clutched in my hand. I shoved it into my tunic. Because of that letter, everything I believed in was dead. I wasn't just a king who had made a mistake. I was the son of a monster. "Malicor thinks I'm broken," I said, a dark smile touching my lips. "He thinks without my power, I am nothing." "He's wrong," Elara said. She reached out and touched my cheek. "Because you aren't alone anymore. You have me, and I have the mountain." What followed was a moment of absolute commitment. I looked into her eyes and I didn't see a girl to be protected. I saw a sovereign to be followed. I knelt before her, right there in the dust and the dark. "I gave my soul for stability," I whispered. "But I will give my life for you. Lead the way, Elara." Chapter 18. The Blood of the Mountain. We didn't go back to the tower. Instead, we went deeper. Elara led me through tunnels I didn't even know existed. Tunnels that smelled of damp earth and ancient iron. We were moving toward the Heartstone, the massive crystal that anchored the Frost-Spire to the mountain's roots. "This is where they did it," Elara whispered, as we entered a cavern of glowing violet quartz. "This is where Malicor's ancestors bled my family to steal the throne." Soon after, she walked toward the center of the cave. A massive spire of rock rose from the floor, pulsing with a rhythmic light. It was the mountain's heartbeat. As she got closer, the iron ring on her neck began to glow so brightly it turned the shadows into day. "If I touch it," she said, her voice trembling, "I can reclaim the defenses. I can lock Malicor out of the palace, but it might kill me, Soren. The power. It's too much for one person." Without thinking, I stepped up behind her. I wrapped my arms around her, my hands covering hers. I felt the vibration of the stone moving through my boots and up into my marrow. "I am the Nullifier," I reminded her. "Even without my magic, my body is built to hold the cold. Use me as a ground. Let the excess power flow through me." She didn't know what scared her more, but she trusted me. Between one breath and the next, she pressed our joined hands against the Heartstone. The air thickened. It didn't just get heavy, it turned into a solid weight. A roar of violet fire erupted from the stone, surging through Elara and into my chest. It felt like being hit by a lightning bolt made of ice. My teeth rattled. My vision went white. In that moment, our souls answered each other. I wasn't dampening her power. I was containing it. We were a circuit, a loop of fire and ice that the mountain had been waiting centuries to complete. "I see it!" Elara screamed. "I see the rot. It's in the council chamber. It's in the guards. Soren, Malachor isn't just a man, he's a parasite. What followed was a vision of the palace's history. We saw the lies. We saw the true face of the black rot, a corruption of the spirit, not the blood. And we saw the plan. Malachor wasn't just trying to kill us. He was trying to shatter the Heartstone to drain the mountain's power for himself. As the silence roared, we pulled away from the stone. We were both gasping, our skin glowing with a faint, ghostly light. "We have to stop him," I said. "Now." Chapter 19. The Traitor's Banquet. We climbed the stairs back to the Great Hall, but we weren't running. We were marching. As we moved, the servants joined us. Cooks with meat cleavers, stable boys with pitchforks, and maids with jars of lye. They were the Shadow Army, and they were tired of living in the dark. By the time we reached the heavy doors of the throne room, I could hear Malachor's voice. He was addressing the council, telling them of my unfortunate madness. "The king is gone!" Malachor shouted. "The Valerius witch has consumed him. We must strike now to save the purity of the—" The doors didn't just open. They exploded. Elara didn't wait for permission. She used the power she had stolen from the Heartstone to blow the iron hinges off the wall. The sound was like a thunderclap in the small room. We stepped through the smoke, Elara in her rags and me with blood on my face. "The king is right here," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through Malachor's screaming like a razor. Not only that, but the nullification was coming back. The Heartstone hadn't just used me as a ground. It had jump-started my magic. I felt a wave of absolute, terrifying silence roll out from me, snuffing out the torches in the room one by one. "Guards!" Malachor shrieked, backing away toward the throne. "Kill them! Kill the traitors!" But then, the silent guard didn't move. They looked at Elara. They looked at the violet fire dancing in her eyes. They were built to serve the mountain, and they knew their true master when they saw her. "They won't help you, Malachor," Elara said. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "Because the mountain knows who you are. It knows what you did to my father." To make things worse for the Inquisitor, the ground beneath his feet began to crack. The very stone of the palace was turning against him. He looked around, his face pale and sweating, realizing that his web of lies had finally snapped. "I will burn you both!" Malachor roared. He pulled a black crystal from his robes, a shard of the rot. He raised it high, intending to shatter it and release the plague into the room. "Soren, now!" Elara cried. Chapter 20. The Choice of Fire. I didn't think so. My body moved on instinct. I lunged across the room, my hand reaching for the black crystal. I knew that if it shattered, everyone in this room would die. In the span of a breath, I caught his wrist. I didn't just grab him. I unleashed every ounce of my nullification into his arm. I wanted to turn his very blood into ice. "You are nothing but a shadow, Malachor," I hissed into his ear. "And I am the man who brings the dark." Still, Malachor was desperate. He bit down on a capsule in his tooth, his eyes turning a milky, sickly black. A wave of darkness erupted from him, pushing me back. It was the rot, pure, concentrated hatred. "If I can't have this kingdom," Malachor laughed, his voice sounding like grinding stones, "then no one will." The black smoke began to spread, eating into the tapestries and the wood of the benches. People began to scream, rushing for the exits. But Elara didn't run. She walked right into the heart of the smoke. "Elara, get back!" I yelled. Rather than listening, she reached out and grabbed my hand. The moment our eyes locked, the smoke stopped. The violet light from the bond met the black fog of the rot, and the two clashed with a sound like 1,000 breaking mirrors. "Together, Soren," she urged. "Fire and ice, use your silence to hold it, and I will burn it away." Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the perfect symmetry of our souls. I wrapped my power around the black smoke, squeezing it, containing it, turning it into a dense, frozen ball of shadow. Then, Elara unleashed the fire. The space between us burned. The white-hot Valerius flame incinerated the rot, turning Malicor's darkness into harmless gray ash. The explosion of light was so bright, it blinded everyone in the room. When the light faded, Malicor was gone. There was nothing left but a pile of white robes and a blackened stain on the floor. The silence that followed was the first true peace I had felt in my entire life. I looked at Elara, her chest heaving, her face covered in sweat and soot. She looked at me, and she smiled. "Is it over?" she whispered. "No," I said, pulling her into my arms. "It's just beginning." As the bond pulsed, deep and steady, I knew the truth. We had crossed the point of no return. The Glacier King was dead. The ghost in the stone was gone. And she let it happen. We stood together in the ruins of the throne room, the new rulers of a world that was finally starting to thaw. Chapter 21. The bitter aftermath. The throne room was a graveyard of broken stone and white ash. I stood in the center of the ruin, my hand still clutching Elara's, but the triumph I expected felt like a mouthful of sand. Malicor was gone, but the air still tasted of rot. My chest felt hollow, a cavernous ache opening where my power used to sit like a steady anchor. "We did it," Elara whispered, but her voice was paper-thin. Next, she swayed. Her eyes rolled back, and the violet fire that had saved us flickered and died. She collapsed against me, her body becoming a dead weight. I caught her, but as I did, a sharp, jagged pain sliced through my own skull. Truth be told, the pulse of the mountain had a price. We had channeled enough power to level a city, and now the mountain was calling in its debt. I tried to lift her, but my arms felt like they were made of lead. "Guards!" I roared, but my voice broke. What followed was not a rescue, but a nightmare. The silent guard, freed from Malicor's mental leash, didn't move toward us with loyalty. They stood in a circle, their iron masks reflecting the dying embers of the room. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were husks. Without Malicor's direction, they were lost, and their lack of purpose created a vacuum of magic that began to drain the very air from the room. To make things worse, the black crystal Malicor had used wasn't entirely destroyed. A single tiny shard lay near the throne, pulsing with a sickly green light. It was the magic-dampening poison in its purest form. "Soren," Elara moaned. Her skin was turning a translucent, waxy gray. Before I could move, the shard hissed. A cloud of invisible, odorless gas filled the dais. My lungs seized. It felt like breathing in liquid glass. My nullification, which had just returned, was snuffed out instantly, not just dampened, but erased. Moments later, I fell to my knees beside her. I couldn't feel her heartbeat. I couldn't feel the bond. The violet string that had connected our souls for the last week had gone slack. It felt like I had gone deaf in my very spirit. Chapter 22, The Silent Prison. They didn't put us in the dungeon. That would have been too merciful. Instead, the surviving council members, men who were just as guilty as Malicor, locked us in the royal bedchamber. It was a gilded cage, a room of silk and gold that felt like a tomb. "Is she breathing?" I croaked. I was slumped against the foot of the bed, my body paralyzed by the dampening poison. Still, the room remained silent. Elara lay on the bed, her chest barely moving. The iron ring on her neck had turned a dull matte black. She looked like a doll made of ash. What followed was the worst torture I had ever endured. I had to watch her slip away, inch by inch, and I couldn't even reach out to touch her hand. The poison had turned my muscles into stone. I was a king of nothing, sitting in a room of ghosts. Because I was arrogant, I whispered to the empty air. Because I thought I could control the fire. I looked out the window. The sky was a bruised purple, the solstice moon rising over the peaks. This was supposed to be our wedding night. Instead, it was our wake. On the other hand, the palace outside was in chaos. I could hear the distant screams of the shadow army being hunted down by the remnants of the regular guard. I had led them into a trap. I had given them hope only to watch it burn. Deep down, she knew the truth, if she could hear me. I had failed her. I had taken a girl who was safe in the shadows and dragged her into a spotlight that was killing her. As the silence stretched, I felt a tear track through the soot on my face. The Glacier King was finally melting, but he was drowning in the puddle. Chapter 23. The Trial of the Scrying Glass. A shimmering light appeared in the center of the room. It was a scrying glass, activated from the council chamber. Malacor's second-in-command, a man named Valerius, ironically named after the house he helped destroy, appeared in the mist. "Look at your queen, Soren," the man sneered. Rather than looking at me, the image shifted. I saw the cellars. I saw the servants I had promised to protect being lined up against the stone walls. They were being branded with the traitor's mark. "The council has decided," the man continued. "The girl dies at dawn, and you will watch. We will keep you alive and dampened, so you can feel every second of the mountain's death." "Leave them alone," I managed to squeeze out. My throat felt like it was filled with needles. Instead of answering, the image shifted back to Elara. She was coughing now, a wet, rattling sound. The rot was in her lungs. Without my nullification to shield her, the mountain's raw power was cooking her from the inside out. "She is the sacrifice the mountain demanded," the voice from the glass said. "The bloodline ends today, and the silence begins." The scrying glass flickered out, leaving me in total darkness. I looked at Elara's pale hand hanging off the edge of the bed. Her fingers twitched, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. At that moment, I felt it. A tiny, microscopic spark. It wasn't in my blood. It wasn't in the air. It was in the bond. It was a flicker of violet, so small it shouldn't have mattered. But it was there. She was fighting. Even in her sleep, even in the grip of the poison, she was trying to find me. As if pulled by a string, my wolf, the real one, the one I had buried 20 years ago, began to howl in the back of my mind. Not a howl of pain, but a howl of war. Chapter 24. The Dark Night of the Soul. The poison was thick, but my rage was thicker. I began to crawl. It took me an hour just to move 3 feet. Every movement felt like my bones were being ground into powder. "I am the king," I grunted. By the time I reached the side of the bed, I was drenched in sweat. I reached up, my fingers trembling, and managed to hook them into the silk sheets. I pulled myself up until my face was inches from hers. She smelled of jasmine and death. "Elara," I whispered. "Listen to my voice." Without thinking, I pressed my forehead against hers. I ignored the screaming pain in my nerves. I ignored the dampening field that was trying to crush my soul. I went deeper, past the poison, past the skin and bone, into the very center of the bond. I saw her there. She was standing in a forest of black trees, the ground dissolving beneath her feet. She was crying, her fire a tiny ember in the palm of her hand. "Soren," her voice echoed in the darkness of our shared mind. "I'm here," I said, "and I'm not letting go." As if the world narrowed, the black trees began to frost over. I didn't try to use magic. I used my memory. I showed her the warmth of the sun. I showed her the first time I held her hand. I showed her the face of the man who loved her. Between us, something cracked. Not the stone, but the poison. Her soul answered. The ember in her hand exploded into a violet sun. I felt the dampening field around me shatter like glass. The magic rushed back into me with the force of a tidal wave, cold, sharp, and absolute. But it was too late. I could hear the council's executioners outside the door. I could hear the sharpening of the blades. "They're coming," Elara whispered in my mind. She opened her eyes, and they were twin pools of violet fire. "Let them come," I said. I stood up, my body no longer heavy. My power was roaring, a blizzard contained in a single man. Moments later, the doors exploded inward. The silent guard rushed in, their spears leveled at my chest. And I let it happen. I stepped forward into the blades, my hand reaching for Elara's. "You want a sacrifice?" I roared, my voice shaking the very foundations of the mountain. "Then take me." The room went white. Chapter 25. The flicker of the flame. The world was a blur of gray and silver, but the violet light at the center of my vision was the only thing that was real. I stood in the wreckage of the bedchamber, the blades of the silent guard mere inches from my throat. My magic was no longer a cold weight, it was a screaming gale fighting the last of the poison in my veins. "Soren." Elara's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. Next, I felt her hand slide into mine. The moment our skin touched, the dampening field didn't just break. It evaporated. A shockwave of pure energy rippled out from us, throwing the guards back against the walls like they were made of straw. Truth be told, I had been holding back for 20 years. I had been afraid of my own shadow. But as I looked at Elara, her hair wild and her eyes glowing like twin stars, I realized I didn't need to be afraid anymore. "The mountain is awake, Soren," she said. Her voice had a metallic ring to it, the sound of ancient stone and deep iron. What followed was a symphony of destruction. We didn't run for the stairs. We walked. Every step I took turned the floor to ice, and every step she took melted it into steam. We were a storm of our own making. "Because they tried to steal our souls," I growled, my power snuffed out a torch in the hallway just by passing it. "Because they thought we were just pieces on a board." Still, the council wasn't finished. As we reached the grand staircase, the air turned oily and black. Malakor's remnants, the shadow priests, emerged from the floor, their hands dripping with the rot. They were desperate, and a desperate man is the most dangerous kind of beast. Chapter 26. The Shadow Army rises. We were outnumbered 10-1. The shadow priests began their chant, a low, discordant sound that made my teeth ache. The rot began to crawl up the walls, eating away at the royal tapestries. "They're blocking the way to the Heartstone," Elara noted, her jaw set in a hard line. Before I could move, a roar echoed from the levels below. It wasn't the sound of monsters. It was the sound of people. "For the king! For the queen!" Soon after, the shadow army burst from the servant passages. The cooks, the maids, the stable hands, they weren't hiding anymore. They flooded the staircase, their improvised weapons gleaming in the violet light Elara projected. Moments later, the battle became a chaotic, bloody mess. I watched a scullery maid tackle a shadow priest into the abyss. I saw my own loyalists turn their spears against the council's elite. At that moment, I realized I wasn't just a king of stone. I was a king of people. "Go to the stone, Elara," I shouted over the din of clashing steel. "I will hold the line." Instead of leaving, she grabbed my collar and pulled me down for a hard, bruising kiss. It tasted like copper and magic. "We go together, Soren. Always." As the silence roared, the silence of my power creating a vacuum around us, we dove into the fray. I used my nullification to freeze the shadow priests in place, while Elara used her fire to shatter them into dust. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't stop the tide. We were a force of nature. Chapter 27. The Gates of the Heart. The descent to the Heartstone was a descent into the marrow of the world. The walls were weeping violet light, and the ground was vibrating with a rhythm that matched our heartbeats. "He's there," Elara whispered. At the bottom of the stairs, standing before the massive quartz spire, was Malakor's second-in-command, Valerius. He had the black crystal shard embedded in his own palm. He was feeding it his life force, trying to force the Heartstone to shatter. "You're too late!" Valerius shrieked, his skin turning a mottled, necrotic black. "The mountain is already poisoned. It will die, and you will die with it." What followed was a moment of absolute clarity. I looked at the stone, seeing the black veins of the rot spreading through the crystal. It looked like a dying lung. "I can't burn it out from the outside," Elara said, her voice trembling. "I have to go in. Soren, I have to merge with the stone." "No," I said, my heart freezing for a reason that had nothing to do with magic. "If you merge with it, you might never come back." "She has to." Valerius laughed, his eyes bleeding black ink. "Or everything falls." By the time the words left his lips, I had made my decision. I didn't think about the crown. I didn't think about the law. "I am the Nullifier," I whispered, stepping toward the black-veined spire. "I can hold the rot. I can keep it still while you burn it." "Soren, it will destroy you," she cried. "In fact," I said, looking her in the eye, "it's the only thing I was ever meant to do. Trust me, Elara. Trust your mate." Without thinking, I lunged forward and grabbed the Heartstone. Chapter 28, The Final Sacrifice. The agony was unlike anything I had ever known. The rot surged into my arms, turning my veins into ice and fire at the same time. I felt the mountain's pain, millions of years of pressure and weight slamming into my consciousness. "Now!" I screamed. Between one breath and the next, Elara placed her hands over mine. The space between us burned. She unleashed every ounce of the Valerius fire, using my body as a bridge to reach the core of the stone. I felt my soul being pulled apart. I saw the stars, the beginning of the world, and the moment the first king was born. As her wolf stirred, her spirit merging with the mountains, the black veins in the crystal began to turn white. The rot hissed as it was vaporized. "Hold on, Soren," she pleaded in my mind. But I was fading. The cold was finally winning. I felt my heartbeat slowing, the rhythm of the mountain becoming my own. I was becoming the stone. Moments later, a massive explosion of light filled the cavern. The black crystal in Valerius's hand shattered, taking his arm and his life with it. The shockwave knocked me backward, my hands charred and smoking. As the echo faded, silence fell. Not the empty silence of my power, but the peaceful silence of a forest after a storm. I lay on the ground, my vision dark. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't feel the air. "Soren?" I felt a warm hand on my cheek. I opened my eyes and saw her. Elara was glowing, literally glowing, with a soft, violet light. She looked down at me, tears streaming through the soot on her face. "Did it work?" I whispered. "The mountain is clean," she said, her voice a sob of joy. "The rot is gone. You saved us, Soren." As the mark tingled on my chest, I felt the bond surge back to life. It was stronger than ever. It was a golden thread that wouldn't let me go. Truth be told, I was ready to die. But as Elara pulled me into her arms, I realized the mountain wasn't done with me yet. "The solstice is here," she whispered, looking up at the light filtering down from the palace above. "Let's go home, King." And she let it happen. She helped me to my feet, and together we began the long climb back to the light. Chapter 29. The Climax of Ash and Light. The throne room was no longer a place of shadows. As we emerged from the depths, the morning sun of the solstice broke through the shattered stained glass windows, turning the dust motes into dancing diamonds. I leaned heavily on Elara, my hands bandaged in strips of her silver silk, but my heart had never felt lighter. What followed was a moment of absolute stillness. The survivors of the council, the remaining silent guard, and the weary shadow army all turned to look at us. They didn't see a monster and a ghost. They saw the mountain itself standing before them in the form of a man and a woman. "It is over," I announced. My voice wasn't a roar, but it carried the weight of the stone behind it. Next, I turned to the council members who had cowered in the corners. They were old men clinging to a dead world. I didn't use my nullification to kill them. Instead, I used the truth. I threw the letter from my father onto the scarred remains of the council table. The black rot was a lie you fed on to justify your greed, I said, each word a hammer blow. You turned this kingdom into a cage, but today, the doors are open. Still, the tension remained until Elara stepped forward. She raised her hand, and the violet light of the Heartstone pulsed through the floorboards. The cracks in the stone began to knit themselves back together. The frost on the walls melted, giving way to the first green shoots of mountain ivy I had seen in 20 years. Because she was the soul of the palace obeyed. The heavy iron doors that had once locked the people out now swung wide, inviting the city to see the dawn of a new age. Chapter 30. The Law of Two Souls. The square in front of the palace was filled with thousands. They had come expecting an execution. Instead, they found a coronation. I stood on the balcony, but I wasn't wearing the heavy, jagged crown of the Nullifier. I had left it on the floor of the archives. For 20 years, I ruled with silence, I shouted to the masses. I thought peace was the absence of sound. I was wrong. Peace is the harmony of two souls. Soon after, I turned to Elara. In front of the entire kingdom, I knelt. Not because the law demanded it, but because my soul required it. I took her hand, the bond pulsing warm and steady between us, a golden thread that would never break. Elara Valerius, I whispered, though the mountain carried my voice to every ear. You were the spark that woke the glacier. Will you be the fire that keeps this kingdom warm? As her wolf stirred, the gentle, protective spirit of the mountain, she pulled me to my feet. She didn't need a crown to look like a queen. She had the light of the sun in her eyes and the strength of the earth in her smile. I will, she said. The roar that went up from the crowd wasn't a scream of fear. It was a cry of joy. It was the sound of a kingdom finally breathing again. What's more, the violet light from our joined hands shot into the sky, shattering the last of the winter clouds. Moments later, the first flowers of spring began to bloom in the window boxes of the city. Chapter 31. The Hearth and the Heart. The days that followed were a blur of healing. We abolished the council and replaced it with a circle of voices, servants, soldiers, and scholars alike. I spent my afternoons in the gardens, not hunting ghosts, but planting seeds. You look different without the scowl, Elara teased. She was sitting on a stone bench, her fingers tracing the ancient carvings that were finally free of ice. Truth be told, I felt different. The Glacier King was a memory, a story told to frighten children. I sat beside her, pulling her into the curve of my arm. The scent of jasmine was no longer a haunting memory. It was the smell of my home. I was thinking about the archives, I said. I want to turn them into a library. No more secrets, Elara. No more shadows. The mountain likes that idea, she murmured, leaning her head on my shoulder. I can feel it. It's resting. For the first time in centuries, it's actually resting. As the silence roared, this time a comfortable, companionable silence, I looked at my hands. The scars from the Heartstone were still there, but they didn't hurt. They were reminders of the price of love. Deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't saved Elara. She had saved me. She had looked at a monster and seen a man worth keeping. What are you thinking about? She asked, looking up at me. I was thinking that the bards were wrong, I said, kissing her forehead. The mate bond isn't a destiny you're born into. It's a choice you make every single day. And just like that, everything was as it should be. Epilogue. The Bloom of Ashes. 1 year later, I stood on the balcony of the high tower watching the sunset. The city below was vibrant, filled with the sounds of music and laughter. The Frost-Spire was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a beacon of hope. Her bones remembered him. Her soul answered mine. I felt Elara step onto the balcony behind me. She was carrying a small bundle wrapped in violet silk. He's asleep, she whispered, stepping into my side. I looked down at our son. He had Elara's dark hair and my silver eyes, but more importantly, his skin was warm. He wouldn't grow up in a world of ice. The Nullifier and the spark, I mused, touching the baby's tiny hand. I wonder what he'll be. He'll be whatever he chooses to be, Elara said firmly. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of 1,000 blooming flowers, I realized that the iron vow of ashes had been fulfilled. We had burned the old world down, and from its ashes we had grown something beautiful. Shadows danced between them, not as enemies, but as partners in the light, and she let it happen. I pulled my family close, looking out over a kingdom that was no longer silent, but singing. The mountain was at peace, and so was